They called it the world's breadbasket. For a century, America controlled the grain that fed half the planet. But today that monopoly just cracked, and it wasn't China that broke it. It was Africa. The United States built its $80 billion food empire on one truth: whoever controls grain, controls power. Grain meant leverage. Grain meant aid. Grain meant political obedience. But now the balance has shifted. Africa's new grain alliance, a coalition of farmers, nations, and scientists, just pulled the rug from under the U.S. food system, and Washington. They didn't even see it coming. Cargo ships leaving Nigeria, rail lines humming through Tanzania, silos rising in Ghana. A digital dashboard flashes. The African Grain Exchange, 1.2 billion metric tons exported. This isn't just another agricultural story. This is a global power shift from the farmlands of Kansas to the heart of Africa, because for the first time in modern history, Africa isn't asking who will feed it. Africa is asking who will it feed. The United States never thought it would lose control of food diplomacy. After all, grain was America's golden weapon. It was used to feed nations and punish them too. But Africa watched, Africa learned, and Africa planned. Decades of quiet coordination, trade summits, experimental seeds, digital marketplaces have finally come together under one banner, the African Grain Alliance. Behind the headlines, a silent revolution has been taking place. A coalition of 22 African nations joined forces to do what the IMF and WTO never wanted them to do: control their own food destiny. They built regional processing plants, launched digital trading platforms, and linked farms to ports with AI-driven logistics. Now, when the world needs grain, they look south, not west. It's the comeback story nobody in Washington wanted to tell. For decades, Africa was flooded with cheap, subsidized American wheat and corn. Local farmers were wiped out. Domestic industries collapsed. But from that collapse rose something powerful: unity. African nations realized the only way to escape food dependency was to build together, and they did. From the dry plains of Niger to the riverbanks of Zambia, a quiet agricultural miracle was growing. While America was lobbying for global dominance, Africa was building resilience. While U.S. corporations invested in lobbying, Africa invested in land. And now that investment is paying off, one harvest at a time. In Washington, they're calling it the African disruption. In Africa, we call it liberation, because this isn't just economics, this is history correcting itself. For too long, African nations grew food but couldn't profit from it. Western grain companies dictated prices, routes, and standards. But with the Grain Alliance, Africa writes its own contracts in African terms, in African currencies, on African platforms. No middlemen, no manipulation, no apologies. They say control of food is control of the world. So what happens when Africa takes control? The world changes, and that's exactly what's happening. The African Grain Alliance isn't just a trade deal, it's an economic weapon built on cooperation, not coercion. By merging resources, technology, and infrastructure, Africa created something America can't outspend. Collective power, 22 nations, one grain standard, one trading system, no IMF, no World Bank, no dependency, just a continent feeding itself and the world. This is Africa's Silicon Valley, but in soil. Digital grain ledgers, blockchain contracts, solar storage hubs, and youth-led cooperatives. America had Wall Street, Africa built Soil Street, and the effects? Devastating for Washington. In less than 2 years, the new Grain Alliance captured markets across Asia and the Middle East. Countries like India, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia replaced U.S. grain imports with African alternatives. Why? Because Africa's grain isn't just cheaper, it's cleaner, greener, and grown without the politics' unfair advantage. Or finally, a fair fight. Because for decades, America sold itself as the world's farmer. But now the farmer has a new name: Africa. Every revolution has a moment when the oppressed becomes the producer. This is that moment. Africa's fields aren't just feeding stomachs, they're feeding sovereignty. Every grain that leaves African soil carries a story of independence, innovation, and identity. A continent once starved by design, now feeding by determination. They said Africa could never compete, that its soil was too weak, its systems too fragile. But the truth? Africa wasn't weak, it was waiting for unity, waiting for opportunity, waiting for this very moment. And now that moment has arrived. The Grain Alliance isn't just Africa's victory. It's a warning shot to every superpower that built empires on African hunger, because the future of food doesn't belong to Washington anymore. It belongs to the motherland.
For more than half a century, America's power wasn't just in its military or its tech. It was in its wheat, its corn, and its control over who could eat and who couldn't. But now the monopoly that once ruled the global food table is cracking, and the fault line runs straight through Africa's soil. When the African Grain Alliance was announced 3 years ago, no one in Washington took it seriously. They called it symbolic political theater, just another African summit. But while the West was busy underestimating, Africa was busy organizing. Behind the speeches and handshakes, African ministers, economists, and engineers were quietly drafting a master plan, a complete restructuring of the continent's food economy. Not through aid, not through charity, but through coordination. At the heart of it all is Page, Africa's first unified grain trading system. It connects farmers, buyers, and exporters across 28 nations in real time. It prices in African currencies, it bypasses Western intermediaries, no IMF rules, no dollar dominance, just Africans trading with Africans and the world coming to them. For decades, U.S. grain corporations dominated Africa's food imports. They used export credits, subsidies, and strategic aid to make African dependence seem like generosity. But the truth is, every bag of American grain came with a chain. If you accepted the food, you accepted the policy. If you accepted the aid, you accepted the influence. And for years, that chain held, until now. The new grain alliance wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the fields, by farmers who refused to sell their future for someone else's surplus. By scientists who believed Africa's soil could do more than just survive, it could sustain. And by a generation that no longer measures progress in promises but in production. Let's be clear, this alliance isn't about competition. It's about correction. Because while America's $80 billion agribusiness empire was built on exploitation, Africa's new model is built on inclusion. Every nation, from the smallest producer to the largest exporter, gets a voice. Every farmer, no matter how remote, has digital access to pricing and policy. For the first time in history, food democracy exists, and it exists in Africa. Washington called it dangerous. Beijing called it disruptive. Europe called it impossible. But Africa calls it day one. Because this isn't the end of dependency, it's the beginning of destiny. Here's what the analysts won't tell you. Africa doesn't need to outproduce America. It just needs to outconnect it. And that's exactly what the new grain alliance is doing. By merging logistics, transport, and data, the continent has turned what used to be scattered power into structured dominance. Grain hubs in Tanzania feed into ports in Mozambique. Rail lines in Zambia move exports straight to Angola's coast, from their global markets open. The system works, and it's working too well for Washington's comfort. Washington's response: predictable. Tariffs, trade warnings, accusations of market distortion. But deep down, they know the truth. You can't tariff momentum. The U.S. food monopoly wasn't broken overnight. It was chipped away by something America never truly understood: African collaboration. Because when the continent acts as one, no empire can compete. And this time, it's not just about feeding Africa. It's about feeding the world on Africa's terms. They used to call us developing. Now they call us disruptive. The same systems they once said would never work are now being studied by their economists. The same crops they called inefficient are now the backbone of global trade forecasts. The story of African grain isn't about catching up. It's about catching control. For too long, African grain flowed out as raw exports, cheap, undervalued, invisible. Now it leaves the continent branded, processed, certified, and profitable. From seed to shipment, the entire chain is African-owned. And that is what terrifies the old guard. There is no weak link left to exploit. Once upon a time, America fed Africa. Now Africa feeds America's former clients. The teacher has become the trader. The buyer has become the supplier. The future has become African. The $80 billion monopoly didn't fall because Africa rebelled. It fell because Africa evolved. Because unity, real, organized, economic unity, is stronger than any trade sanction. And when 1 billion people start planting with one vision, no global power can stop the harvest. They called it impossible. They called it naive. Now they call it unstoppable. This is Africa's rise, not as a consumer, but as a provider. Not as a pawn, but as a power. It's no longer theory. It's no longer potential. It's reality. Africa's new grain alliance, Hassanti, just challenged America's food empire. It has replaced it. For decades, Washington built its global influence through food diplomacy. They fed the hungry, and in return, the hungry stayed loyal. They shipped grain as aid and called it generosity. But behind the smiling handshakes and development projects, there was always a quiet truth. Control the food, and you control the future. Now that control is gone. What the world is witnessing isn't just a trade win. It's a paradigm shift. For the first time since the end of colonialism, Africa controls the full cycle. From soil to storage, from shipping to sales, no middlemen, no dependence, no foreign dictates. Just African grain, African gain. Let's talk numbers. In less than 3 years, the African Grain Alliance captured nearly 38% of the global wheat import market in Asia. U.S. agribusinesses, especially those backed by giant firms like Cargill and ADM, lost billions. Washington tried to respond, deploying trade envoys, pushing subsidies, even lobbying African leaders to reconsider. But the answer was clear and unified. No, Africa doesn't need American food to survive. America needs African grain to compete. The U.S. system relied on 3 things: subsidies, dominance, and dependency. But Africa changed the rules. Instead of subsidies, we built sustainability. Instead of dominance, we built distribution. And instead of dependency, we built democracy in food. That's the secret. That's the revolution. What began as a regional experiment has turned into the backbone of the global South through digital grain exchanges. African producers now trade directly with India, Indonesia, and the Middle East. Payments flow through Pan-African financial systems, no dollars needed. The U.S. Federal Reserve can't sanction it. The World Bank can't block it, because the entire ecosystem exists outside Western control. This is the power of unity. The power of designing your own system instead of renting someone else's. When Africa stopped waiting for validation, it started generating value. And that's what truly broke the $80 billion monopoly. America's agribusiness lobby is panicking. Reports leaked from Capitol Hill reveal emergency meetings between senators, trade representatives, and corporate lobbyists. Their biggest question: how did we lose Africa? But they never had Africa to begin with. They only had access, and access is not ownership. Africa is no longer the silent participant in the global food story. It's the author. This is more than economics. It's identity. Because when you feed yourself, you free yourself. For centuries, Africa's greatest strength, its land, was exploited to feed others. Now that same land is feeding the future. Every grain exported carries a message. We are no longer your charity project. We are your competition. Even U.S. consumers are feeling the shift. African grain, cheaper, organic, and non-GMO, is entering health markets in Europe and Asia. Supermarkets label it African pure. Sales are skyrocketing. Meanwhile, American soy and corn face oversupply and shrinking demand. The once unshakable agribusiness giants are downsizing. And quietly, very quietly, Wall Street is investing in Africa's soil. For the first time in history, African agriculture isn't a symbol of struggle. It's a symbol of stability. The same headlines that once spoke of food insecurity now speak of food sovereignty. The same nations once dependent on aid now export abundance. And America's biggest weapon, its food power, has lost its bite. But make no mistake, this victory didn't come easy. It came from years of sabotage, sanctions, and manipulation. Western banks tried to block funding. Global agencies tried to audit African projects out of existence. But unity, once planted, doesn't die easily. It grows. And now it's unstoppable, because this isn't about agriculture anymore. It's about authorship. Africa isn't just feeding the world, it's feeding the narrative. And every ton of grain exported carries proof that Africa doesn't need permission to prosper. Across the Atlantic, U.S. farmers are waking up to a new reality. They're no longer the benchmark, they're the backup, and in the halls of Washington, policymakers whisper what they never thought they'd admit aloud. Africa has built a system we can't control. That's not just economics, that's power. From the farmer in Burkina Faso to the engineer in Rwanda, from the dock worker in Ghana to the trader in Lagos, this is their story. The story of a continent that refused to stay hungry in a world full of food. The story of a people who decided that sovereignty starts with the soil. America's food empire is unending because Africa hates it. It's ending because Africa outgrew it. Because dependency is a choice and Africa finally chose differently. And that choice, unity, innovation, independence, has redrawn the map of global food power forever. They built their monopoly on our hunger. We built our freedom from our harvest. And now the same soil they once called unproductive has become the engine of global supply. This isn't charity. This isn't luck. This is legacy, and it's written in grain. This is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, one that the world didn't see coming. Because when they spoke of global food power, they never imagined Africa at the table. When they built systems to keep Africa dependent, they never expected Africa to rewrite the rules. But that's exactly what happened. Let's remember where this all began. For decades, the United States stood as the king of global agriculture. Its soybeans, corn, and wheat shaped economies and dictated politics. Nations rose or fell depending on America's trade policy. But in 2025, that balance shifted. The birth of the African Grain Alliance wasn't just a business deal, it was a declaration of independence. Those words became a promise, and that promise became a movement, because for the first time in modern history, African nations looked at their soil not as a resource to be exported, but as a foundation for power. They didn't wait for the IMF's approval. They didn't seek Washington's validation. They simply acted together. The alliance did something the US never expected. It built unity around crops by linking East, West, and Southern Africa under one agricultural framework. From Kenya's maize belt to Nigeria's sorghum plains, the continent created its own ecosystem. Shared research labs, shared logistics, shared markets, and most importantly, a shared currency for trade. The Afri-Grain credit system became the backbone of a food economy that couldn't be sanctioned or controlled. While the world mocked Africa for trying to go digital, Africa quietly built the world's most adaptive agricultural system. A system not built on speculation but on survival, not on aid but on ambition. That's what Washington missed. When the first major buyers from Asia and the Middle East switched from U.S. soy to African sorghum, the shock in American trade circles was immediate. Senators demanded answers. Analysts called it a temporary shift, but it wasn't temporary, it was tectonic. By the time the U.S. realized what was happening, Africa had already formed long-term export contracts worth billions. The monopoly had been broken, quietly, efficiently, permanently. This wasn't about beating America at its own game. It was about refusing to play it. For too long, Africa was told it couldn't compete because it lacked infrastructure, technology, or capital. But no one realized that the true capital was the land itself and the people who never stopped believing in its power. Every revolution has its symbol. For the African Grain Alliance, it was the seed. Each seed planted represented not just food but freedom. Each harvest represented not just profit but proof that the narrative of African poverty was a lie built to protect Western privilege, proof that innovation doesn't need permission when purpose is strong enough. They told us we were too fragmented. We became federated. They said we were too dependent. We became defiant. They warned that unity was impossible. We proved that unity was unstoppable. That's how Africa's new grain alliance crushed an $80 billion monopoly, not with weapons or sanctions, but with willpower and wisdom. And what of America? The once mighty giant of food exports now faces its own reckoning. Reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture show declining exports to Africa and Asia. Major companies from Cargill to Archer Daniels Midland are scaling down operations, cutting staff, and rethinking strategies. The U.S. government calls it market rebalancing. But in truth, it's a power correction. Because Africa is no longer a buyer in America's system, it's a builder of its own. For every dollar America loses, Africa gains not just profit but pride. This shift isn't just measured in GDP or trade volume. It's measured in dignity restored. Because for generations, food insecurity was used as a weapon, a silent form of control. Now that weapon has been disarmed. Africa feeds itself. Africa feeds the world, and America can only watch. But here's the real story, the one that won't make Western headlines. The alliance isn't about defeating the West. It's about defining the future. A future where no African child sleeps hungry while foreign ships leave with full cargo holds. A future where the word export means empowerment, not exploitation. A future where food is not just sustenance, it's sovereignty. That's the legacy of the African Grain Alliance. It's not just crushing America's monopoly, it's crushing the mindset that said Africa could never lead. And while Washington debates policy, Africa builds possibility. Let's be honest, this is more than a trade victory. It's spiritual, it's historical. Because every farmer who tills the land today carries the memory of ancestors who were forced to grow food for others. Today, that same soil grows for Africa's children. The balance of power has shifted not with conflict but with cultivation. From the plains of Zambia to the coasts of Senegal, from the delta of the Nile to the valleys of Ethiopia, Africa has done what few thought possible. It turned agriculture into diplomacy. It turned trade into transformation. It turned the global south into the center. America's $80 billion food monopoly was never defeated by force. It was defeated by foresight, because Africa stopped selling potential and started exporting power. And that's the story future generations will tell. Not of aid and dependency, but of awakening and determination. The world used to say Africa couldn't feed itself. Now the world eats from Africa's harvest. This is not revenge. This is renaissance. Because when the soil rises, the people rise, and when the people rise, the world changes.